And welcome everyone to the 700 Club. President Trump is facing a fresh firestorm of bipartisan criticism today for his latest comments about the Charlottesville riots. Perhaps the chief complaint, the president saying there were, quote, very fine people on both sides. Heather Sells has more.
The president said there is blame on both sides for what happened in Charlottesville. He talked about what he called the alt-left, charging with clubs at the alt-right.
What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt?
There is evidence of violence on the alt-left side, like these photos. The president also defended himself from critics who say he should not have waited 2 days to condemn specific groups in Charlottesville.
I wanted to make sure, unlike most politicians, that what I said was correct, not make a quick statement.
The president spoke of, quote, very fine people on both sides and said that both sides were to blame. It's that perspective that has so many on both the left and right outraged. Even former presidential candidates Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney denounced the comments. Perhaps the only ones who seemed truly pleased, the protesters. David Duke, the former leader of the KKK, thanked Trump on Twitter for his honesty and courage. As more and more cities move to remove Confederate statues, the president wondered aloud what's next.
Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson?
Overnight, city crews in Baltimore began removing Confederate monuments, and in Birmingham, Alabama, crews covered a Confederate statue while the city debates legal options to remove it. In the nation's capital, vandals defaced the Lincoln Memorial, using red graffiti and explicit language. Amidst all the unrest, the father of Charlottesville victim Heather Heyer is setting an example. He says he forgives the man who killed his daughter.
People need to stop hating, and they need to forgive each other, you know, and I include myself in that, in forgiving the guy that did this, okay? He don't know no better. You know, I just think of what the Lord said on the cross. Lord, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing.
Many church leaders this week are calling for a full condemnation of white supremacists with no exceptions. They are also calling for the church to lead the way in a country that needs racial reconciliation and healing, perhaps now more than ever. Heather Sells, CBN News.
Thanks, Heather. CBN News chief political correspondent David Brody joins us now with more from Washington. David, do you think the president was perhaps trying to reach a specific audience yesterday?
Wendy, I think this was Donald Trump being Donald Trump. And, you know, he's not calculating exactly who he's trying to reach. I know there's talk about him trying to reach, quote, the base and all of that. Look, I think here's what went down yesterday at Trump Tower. I think it's pretty simple, and unfortunately, it's relatively complicated as well. There really should have been 4 press conferences there. You know, he came to talk about infrastructure, and as a matter of fact, during the press conference, he kept saying, anybody got a question about infrastructure? No one obviously did. So there was the infrastructure part of the press conference, and then the second part is where he needed to step to a separate microphone, if you will, and talk about the KKK and denounce that and have a full stop there, because what they have done and said, and it's absolutely atrocious. And then there was a third microphone that should have been set up, talking about the media and how they're spinning things left and right and all of that, mostly to the left, if you will. And then the fourth microphone, which is the big one, the racism argument, if you will, the racism narrative that needed to be put out there, talking about how, yes, in this country, we've had this, we've had the both sides comment and all of that, but it needed to be framed in a much more contextual environment. And instead, it ended up kind of being this whole mosh pit of words in a Trump press conference that in essence ran amok, and the media had a field day with it.
Well, David, speaking of infrastructure, how do you think, what bearing might this whole Charlottesville situation have on his agenda, especially cooperation or support from Congress?
Well, you know, Wendy, he had a tough job going in. Remember, he hadn't been a Republican for a long time in his career. He really had no standing with the Republican Party because he didn't really have many favors to cash in, if you will. And now he's a politically incorrect president dealing with a lot of Republican politicians who want to be politically correct. And the problem with that is that just is not a good mix, and it does not bode well for his agenda. Having said that, one thing I've learned, never count Trump out. It just seems like when you think the guy is off and it's just not going to work out for him, all of a sudden he pulls the rabbit out of the hat somehow, some way. We'll see.
Do you know if anyone in the White House was caught off guard by anything the president said yesterday?
Well, put it this way, they were frustrated for sure. I mean, there's that picture of John Kelly, the new chief of staff, looking down, staring at the floor, not necessarily shaking his head, but there were some other staffers that were clearly a bit frustrated that the president had to do this because, I mean, clearly, you know, there's been some mixed messages here. I don't think that's doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. Anytime you have a mixed message on something like this, that's going to give a lot more fuel to the fire here, Wendy.
So is timing really the problem here? So the president made a statement Saturday. He spoke on camera Monday. Then he took questions from reporters Tuesday. Did he gain or lose ground over the last few days?
Well, you know, the media wants to have this narrative that, you know, he's changed positions and all. Look, if you go back to every statement he made, Saturday, Monday, and then Tuesday, he actually said both sides all three times. And on Monday, he did mention the KKK and neo-Nazis by name. And yesterday, he actually also denounced them by name as well. So there's been a little bit more consistency than the media likes to say. Having said that, look, if you've got David Duke tweeting out thanks to the president, you know, Houston, we have a problem at that point. And the president obviously would need to understand that. Anytime you don't have a clear delineation mark between what the KKK is all about and some of these other side comments, well, then you're just giving air and oxygen to the white supremacist neo-Nazi folks who are spewing hate left and right and clearly from the pit of hell.
All right, David Brody, we appreciate your insight. And today on our Faith Nation show, David and our D.C. team will have more about President Trump's response to Charlottesville. We'll hear from one of the president's evangelical advisors, Pastor Robert Jeffress of First Baptist in Dallas. That all happens at 12:30 on our CBN News Facebook page. You'll want to get that as well. Well, John Jessup has more of today's top stories from our news bureau in Washington. Hey, John.
Thanks, Wendy. The Trump administration is taking a strong stance in the fight for religious freedom around the world. The Secretary of State issuing a new report card giving bad marks to a number of countries, including China and a U.S. ally, Saudi Arabia. CBN's national security correspondent Eric Rosales breaks down the list.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson held nothing back when he named the group ISIS as one of the biggest threats to religious freedom across the globe. He says the group is responsible for genocide against Shiite Muslims, Yazidis, and Christians.
Their terrorist members have and continue to target multiple religions and ethnic groups for rape, kidnapping, enslavement, and even death.
Tillerson said the State Department under President Donald Trump will continue to help those seeking to live their lives according to their faith.
No one should have to live in fear, worship in secret, or face discrimination because of his or her beliefs. As President Trump has said, we look forward to a day when, quote, people of all faiths, Christians and Muslims and Jewish and Hindu, can follow their hearts and worship according to their conscience.
The report released Tuesday looks at the state of religious freedom in 199 foreign countries and describes what the U.S. is doing to support those rights. There are several countries of particular concern, including China, Iran, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia. China is cited for continuing to physically abuse, detain, arrest, torture, and imprison Christians and other religious minorities. Tillerson pointed to Iran for its persecution of Christians and others, plus laws that deny their citizens freedom of religion.
20 individuals were executed in 2016 on charges that included, quote, waging war against God. Members of the Baha'i community are in prison today simply for abiding by their beliefs.
In Saudi Arabia, the government does not recognize the rights of non-Muslims to practice their religion in public. And as for North Korea, which the Christian nonprofit watchdog group Open Doors International calls the most oppressive place in the world for Christians, Tillerson said the government continues to punish those engaging in religious practices last year, with executions, torture, and other abuse. The State Department began releasing this annual report since the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 was amended by President Clinton to help better understand and protect religious freedom as a foreign policy. Eric Rosales, CBN News, Washington.
Thanks, Eric. Iceland has nearly achieved a shocking goal. The country has eliminated almost 100% of children with Down syndrome. That's because they've aborted almost all of them. CBS News reports it's due to the widespread use of prenatal screening. And even though most people born with Down syndrome live long, healthy lives, nearly all pregnant women in Iceland have chosen to abort them. Other countries are doing the same thing. Denmark has aborted 98%. And the U.S. has aborted roughly 70% of babies with the genetic disorder. Dr. James Dobson spoke out against what's happening in Iceland, saying, "I have rarely seen a story that so closely resembles Nazi-era eugenics. This practice is as equally inhumane as the views of the racist bigots who disgraced our country in Charlottesville this past weekend." Wendy, back to you.
John, it's so hard to believe that that is happening in today's world.